Okay, I'm very pleased. My name's Joan Goddard, and I'm a member of the San Jose WILPF branch, and I'm very pleased to um, be able to introduce Paul Kivel, who will be speaking with us for uh, close for about half an hour plus, and then there'll be some question and answer time and a little wrap up from him. And then Darian has some information to share with us after that before we get on to the Philadelphia branch program section. So, besides, of course, the several periods of past WILPF US focus on racial justice and interracial matters and so on, the last year in December actually produced through the fall, developed uh, the AFRICOM webinar was last December, and that was sponsored by Disarm, the End Wars Issue Committee, and also the National Black Alliance for Peace and other organizations as well. And then after that, I believe in January, but maybe February, Robin Lloyd had a session which was wonderful, a follow-up webinar with women's messages and speaking to us from women in the WILPF sections in Africa. Meanwhile, Darian had asked Eileen Kurkowski, and then Janice Hawkins and I joined Eileen in working through the winter and into the spring on developing ideas. And Janice was working very diligently, as many of you know, on a resources list that has been shared somewhat already, and you will get more exposure to it if you haven't already. And she is planning to keep updating it. In May and June, this group of Eileen, Janice, and I, which had somehow or other gotten the name uh, Anti-Racism Team, ART, set up a 7 week, 7 sessions over 8 weeks, skipping Memorial Day, with Paul Kivel's book, Uprooting Racism, How White People Can Work for Racial Justice. And there is Paul. Great. I didn't see you out of the corner of my eye when they spotlighted you. So that's great that you're visible now. So meanwhile, several branches have been having book groups on using different books, including Philadelphia, which we'll hear more about later. And others are planning to develop book groups and other activities and projects. And many of us are looking forward to the time when we are able to get out and about and go to local interracial and racial justice groups and meet people we may have known already and see what they're working on and see how we can contribute and how we can report back to our branches and how we can find women in those groups, hopefully, who would like to join WILPF. So at this point, I want to introduce Paul, and I have managed not to have in front of me the things that are in the program sheet page on the website. And so I think probably most of you have read those things, unless you only looked at the very brief title in the listing for the program for the whole month. I was working towards getting those words in front of me. But basically, Paul has been working for a long time in this decades in this field, in this subject area, along with other interests and strengths and things that he works on. And what we are going to hear from him tonight or today, tonight for some of you, will give some background and also how he sees that relating to a national group like WILPF at this time. And just in case people haven't seen, most of the members of WILPF, I'm sure, have heard of SURJ, Showing Up for Racial Justice. And Paul is one of the founding group of SURJ. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay. I'm glad to be with you for this conversation at the conference, and appreciate the dedication that WILPF is, the focus that WILPF is putting on racial justice in this current times. So I want to start out with a land acknowledgement. I am I live and work on Chochenyo Ohlone land, unceded land. For thousands of years, the Ohlone peoples in the Bay Area have protected the land, lived on the land, nurtured and sustained it, lived interdependently with it. And of course, I acknowledge that I'm part of the group of colonial settlers who have taken that land and have a responsibility to repair that damage and to support the Ohlone struggles today. And if we're beginning to talk about white supremacy, about racism, then we need to start with talking about the land, the theft of the land, the genocide against Native peoples, because racism really begins in this country, following from European conquest and the doctrine of discovery, and is one of the foundational pieces of how racism works. So I encourage you to think about whose indigenous land you're on, and we'll be coming back to that in a little bit. I also want to take a couple minutes to do a little context setting, because it's important that we kind of locate ourselves politically and economically when we're talking about these kinds of issues. We're in the middle of three major global crises. One is war and militarism, which I know you all are aware of. We're currently involved with the attack of, at last count, I had 9 different predominantly Muslim countries in the Middle East and North Africa. We have military bases around the world. And of course, the countries we are mostly attacking, bombing, subverting are countries that are predominantly people of color. And it's a continuation of a 500 years of history of white settler colonialism around the world. The second crisis is the economic one. We are now in a period of economic recession. Millions of people do not have jobs. Tens of millions of people are hungry. Tens of millions of people have lack of housing and lack of adequate medical care. And of course, the hardest hit in our economy are communities of color and poor and working class white communities. The third crisis we face is the global climate emergency. And we're daily getting more information about the accelerating impact of climate change on our lives. I happen to be living here in Northern California, where we've got tremendous fires going on for many years in a row now. There's severe drought and there's smoke in the air. The quality of the air in the Bay Area is deteriorated a great deal because of those fires. I think we all know the impact of that. And of course, communities of color have often been at the front lines of both suffering the consequences of environmental degradation and also have been leaders of the resistance to that environmental crisis. And we can look at places like Standing Rock and the Line 3 defense and just around the world at the role that people of color have played in trying to stem the crisis of emergency that we face. Of course, on top of all that, we're in the middle of a global pandemic, and the distribution of vaccines around the world is obviously partly a racial issue, and people of color are 3 times as likely in the United States to get COVID and twice as likely to die from the impact of that. So whatever issue we look at, we have to acknowledge that racism, white supremacy is a foundational piece of who's being impacted, who's being protected. And that's really a key aspect of understanding how racism is foundational to our society. And of course, the final thing I just want to mention in terms of context is we're in the middle of a declining empire. And that means that we are experiencing a tremendous amount of chaos, and that the ruling class of this country, predominantly white, male, Christian men, are making decisions to try to manage that decline, to distract our attention from what's going on by focusing our attention on people of color, African Americans, Latinx folks, immigrants, Muslims, and trying to maintain their power and control while distracting us from seeing what's really going on. I've found that over the years, there's two questions that have really helped guide me in the work that I do. So I just want to share those with you for a moment. The first question is the question we often ask ourselves and each other. It's the question of, what do I stand for? What kind of person am I? Am I a person of honesty, respect? Do I treat others well? Ultimately, it's a question of, am I a person of integrity? And in a society like ours, it's so based upon competition and individualism, it's important that we ask ourselves that question and periodically check in to see if, in fact, we are holding to those values. The second question, though, I think is more equally as important, but one we don't often ask. And it's the question of, who do I stand with? So I want to say a little bit more about this because I think it really has guided me in terms of thinking about what does it mean to be a white person and showing up as an ally in struggles around racial justice. When I first started becoming an activist in the late 1960s, on my college campus, African American students came to some of us who were white, and they were angry and outraged at the levels of racism they were experiencing on the campus. And my first response was kind of to throw up my hands and say, well, I'm not racist. I treat everybody with respect. I'm a good person is basically what I'm saying. And it's not my problem. And they said, well, it's fine that you're not racist, but we're experiencing racism on this campus and in the healthcare system, educational system, in the job market. Do you stand with us in the struggle for racial justice? And that was a much harder question for me to answer because they weren't asking me what I believed or what I thought or stood for. They were asking me, how was I actually showing up in concrete and specific ways to work for racial justice? About 10 years later, the women's liberation movement was alive and well, and women were angry and outraged about issues of male violence. And some of those women came to us, some of us who were men in the San Francisco Bay Area, and with the stories of male violence and their anger at what was going on. And again, being kind of a slow learner, I threw up my hands and say, well, I treat women with respect. I don't hit my partner. I do childcare and housework and all of that stuff. And they said, well, that's fine, but there's 2 to 3 million men a year who batter their partners in the United States. Do you stand with us in the struggle to end male violence? And again, I had to step back and really take stock and think about, how am I showing up? What am I doing? It's fine to be stand for all these good things and to think of myself as a good person, but as Howard Zinn famously said, you can't be neutral on a moving train. If we're involved in this society, then we are part of the problem if we're not part of the solution. So that question, who do you stand with, is a crucial one for us to grapple with. I just want to say a couple of words about what I mean about when I say white supremacy or racism, because I think we have to look at 4 different levels to understand what's going on. Racism is not about prejudice or stereotypes or bias. We all in this society, because of our schools and media, have lots of misinformation and stereotypes and lies about other people. And we're responsible for that. But that's not the levels that racism operates on. The first level is interpersonal racism, where I can take my presence and power and connections as a white person, and I can commit an act of discrimination, marginalization, or abuse towards a person of color, or commit a hate crime or something that's on that interpersonal level. And that's important to notice, to learn about, to look at our individual behavior. But racism operates on three other levels that are really crucial to understand. One is the institutional level, the way that the policies, procedures, and everyday actions of the institutions that we're part of perpetuate racial inequality. And by that, I mean in the educational system, in the healthcare system, in the criminal legal system, in the media. And that's regardless of my personal intent if I'm inside one of those institutions. So I can be a teacher in a school, in a multiracial classroom. I can be a white teacher, teach all of my students well, help them learn the material and move on to the next level. But if I'm in a school that systematically disciplines students of color more harshly than white students, or channels more of the white students into advanced placement courses, or doesn't have a curriculum that reflects the contributions of people of color to our society, then I'm teaching in an institution that's perpetuating racism regardless of my personal practice and intention. And it's really important that we have a responsibility for the institutions that we're part of beyond our personal practice. The other, one other level that we have to look at in terms of racism is the structural level, because it's not just separate institutions in our society, but these institutions work together to create an overall structure of racism and reinforces the racism in different ways. Sometimes we talk about a school to prison pipeline, for instance, the ways schools systematically push students of color out of our schools, and racial profiling by the police and other institutions pick up those students and put them in incarceration. And then, of course, that, in fact, it limits their ability for further education. It also limits their job possibilities. And so there's also a job, an economic institution component of that. And of course, people without economic means often end up as homeless. And so there's also housing. The institution of housing is impacted. So all of these institutions work together to reinforce each other and create a structure of racism in our society. And then finally, we have to look at the cultural level, the way that every day our media, our textbooks, our religious stories and histories reinforce the sense of white superiority, white entitlement, and portray people of color as less than, as dangerous, as outsiders, as marginalized, and as threats to our communities. So when I talk about white supremacy or racism, I'm talking about all of those different levels and how do we become active and involved at different levels, depending upon where we're located in our communities and in our lives. So one of the things that I think is important is to think about, so one of the things racism does is it gives white people benefits that people of color are excluded from. And I'm sure you've all heard about white privilege, and you may have been part of an exercise that ran through a whole series of questions about white privilege. But I want to take a few minutes to dive a little bit more deeply into what I mean by the benefits we gain, in a way that lets us look a little bit more seriously about what are the implications of being beneficiaries of racism, and what are ways we can shift those benefits to leverage them into resources for racial justice. So this is particularly for those of you who are white or identify as white on the call, but for those of you who identify as multiracial or people of color, then it's fine to also go through this thought process because we all in the United States benefit from a global white supremacy just from being part of the society and the beneficiaries of the US empire and the way that colonization has worked in the world. So we'll just do a couple of these things. But the first one is to think about whose land do you live on? Who are the specific Native Americans who are entitled to the land that you live on? What do you know about who they are? What do you know about when and how they were dispossessed of the land? What is the history there? Where do they live now? Under what circumstances? What are their current struggles for land, sovereignty, and recognition? And finally, how could you find out more about the Native peoples living in your area so that you could support their organizations and struggles? I want to take another area to look at, which is immigration. Where did your immigrant foreparents come from? How and why did they come? What might have happened to them if they couldn't have immigrated? And what opportunities and challenges did they face once here? What language, customs, rituals, or other practices did your family give up to be accepted as white? What stories of immigrant success does your family tell about your foreparents? And how do these stories compare with the current narrative about recent immigrants to this country that we hear in our media today? So I want to look at another area of jobs. And I should say that this exercise is on my website, so don't be worried about writing it down or remembering it. Were your ancestors immigrants who took jobs in railroads, streetcars, construction, shipbuilding, wagon and coach driving, house painting, tailoring, longshore work, bricklaying, table waiting, working in the mills, farming, dressmaking, or any other trade or occupation where people of color were largely driven out or excluded? What kind of jobs did your immigrant foreparents have access to? What kinds of personal, family, community, or governmental support helped them to succeed? And how could you use the experiences of your foreparents to counter the anti-immigrant stories that are told in our country about recent immigrants? I want to just do quickly two more. One is around clothing. So take a pause, a breath. Where do your clothes come from? Who makes them? Under what conditions? What are those workers' current struggles for better wages and working conditions? How could you find out more about their struggles? I'm going to stop there, but we could continue on and looking at food, healthcare, at all kinds of different issues. It's one thing to kind of know abstractly that we have privileges. It's another to think about how our everyday lives are interdependent with tens of thousands of people around the world, most of them women, most of them women of color, men and women of color. And our everyday well-being is based on the exploitation of those people in our lives. So one of the things we have to acknowledge is that it's not accidental that we don't know a lot of this information, of a lot of these connections, because the white male Christian ruling class of this country has created and used racism for two main reasons. One is to be able to exploit people, to exploit both people of color and white people. And two, to distract those of us who are white, our attention from the power and wealth that's accumulated in our ruling class. And so we need to be able to understand that this is strategic, it's deliberate, it's not some act of nature or biology or anything else, that it's part of the work of doing unlearning racism and becoming activists for racial justice is to understand that racial capitalism, the way our society is set up to concentrate wealth and power, is deliberate and is therefore, it's movable, it's changeable, because it has been changed in the past and it can be in the future. So I want to say, just before we open it up to questions, some things about being an ally. What does it mean to stand with people of color for racial justice? The first thing is clear that is you can't be an ally if you don't understand how power works in our society. If you don't know, if you don't really understand how economic power works and is concentrated and manipulated, if you don't understand how race and gender and other issues, systems of oppression are organized in ways to benefit certain groups of people. But a lot of people think that being an ally is an identity, that it's something that you claim. Being an ally is more acting as an ally. It's a practice. It's an everyday practice. If we're white, we wake up every day and we have a new set of opportunities to show up for racial justice, to be doing the work. And there's no badge that we get, no ultimate qualifications, and even claiming the word ally is a little bit, it's a little bit tenuous because it's always temporary. It depends upon how we are continuing to show up in our communities. Showing up as an ally means showing up, understanding the intersectionality of the issues of race, class, gender, sexual orientation, ability, etc., and the ways that it's not just that there's margins, but there's people who are on the margins of the margins. And it's easy, if we're talking about race and racism, to kind of ignore the contributions of women of color, or the leadership of women of color, or the leadership of queer and trans people of color to the movement. So people of color with disabilities often get invisibilized. So we have to keep asking not only who's on the margins, whose voices aren't heard, who doesn't have power to in our society, but we have to ask the further question, well, who's on the margins of the margins, and understand the intersectionality of all of these issues. Acting as an ally is not being a savior or a hero, and often the way we live in a culture that's held up, usually white men, obviously, as heroes and saviors, but even white women as saviors and helpers. And of course, our country itself defines itself as in terms of manifest destiny and American exceptionalism, is one that shows up and saves other people in other countries. And we often justify war, as I'm sure all of you know, on the basis of helping people, of humanitarian intervention. And so we really have to let go of that hero or savior myth and ideology. And we have to understand that the only way to legitimately show up as an ally is to show up from an understanding of our mutual interest with people of color for building a society in which all of us can thrive. And that means understanding what does it cost us as white people, and what is our stake in the game, so to speak, because we're not doing this for people of color, we're doing it for the health and safety and healing of our own communities, for our children, for the natural environment. And so this concept of mutual aid, which is one we operate with in SURJ, showing up for racial justice, which I'll come back to in a little bit, is a really key part of being an ally, understanding our mutual interest in this struggle. And finally, I want to just say that it's about our impact, not our intention. I assume that we're all good people. We want to do the right thing. But it's not about whether we're good or bad people. It's about how do we show up and what impact we're having, how effective that is. And I'll say a couple more things in a minute about what that means, what that looks like. But I found that there's two aspects of the work of being an ally. One is direct solidarity work, which is the way that we leverage our resources, time, money, energy, connections, knowledge, skills, experience, towards the struggles, grassroots struggles led by people of color for racial justice. And that's always important. As white people and white society, we have locked up the resources, the money, the education, the access. And the only way to undo that is through leveraging our personal resources, but also working for reparations and redistribution of wealth and other ways to support the communities that we're in partnership with. The second aspect of ally work is in educating and mobilizing our own people, other white people. This has been a call by people of color for the last 100 years. And there's many prominent leaders of color who've turned to white coworkers or colleagues and said, you need to organize your own people, organize your own communities. And it's an absolutely critical part of the work, and it's the work that Showing Up for Racial Justice has been really focused on for the last 10 years now. And so what does that work look like? Well, in order to educate and mobilize white people, we have to do the work of educating ourselves. We have to unlearn. We have to spend time listening to the voices of people of color and what they're doing, what they're saying, what they're analyzing. And so that we can prepare ourselves to show up in a way that's actually useful and effective. And I'm sure all of you have experience with men who wanted to be allies and showed up and actually were more of a problem or a nuisance or in the way than actually helpful to what you were trying to do. And the same thing follows from being white, is unless we do the work on ourselves with each other, we're not going to show up effectively. We have to break white silence. Silence in this case, white silence, is complicity with racism. And we are each every day in lots of relationships with white people. We have access to white people, our children, our family members, our friends, our neighbors, our co-workers. And we need to be having the conversations about racism and about racial justice and about what's happening and ways to get involved. not to call people out or put them down, but to call them into the struggle, to invite them to join us in the powerful work of working in multiracial alliance with people of color. So breaking the silence in white communities is a key part of being an ally. And we each have lots and lots of daily opportunities to do that. We also are involved with institutions and organizations. And so we need to think about our role in our workplace, in our schools, in our neighborhood groups, in whatever organizations and institutions we're part of. What is our role there? How is racism playing out? How can we get together with other people in that organization to make a difference, to start leveraging the resources towards more racial equity in those organizations and institutions? And then, of course, we have to be challenging public policy that is perpetuating racism. And that could be electoral work, that can be city council work, it can be statewide work, but there's lots of ways that we need to be addressing the way that public policy is continually shaped to perpetuate racism and to marginalize and exclude people of color. So in all of this work as allies, one key piece is being accountable. Accountable to the grassroots leadership of people of color in our communities and nationwide. And really that's a lot of the work that SURJ does is accountable work with people of color-led organizations, often women of color-led organizations. And that is at a personal level and an organizational level. And I know that it was mentioned that WILPF has accountability relationships with other national, international organizations. I hope those are solid and actually accountable relationships, just rather than just, well, we know so-and-so at that organization, but we actually need to be taking leadership from the people on the front lines of these struggles. But that's also true at the local level, and the 175 chapters of SURJ are each accountable at the local level to people of color-led partner organizations. And so the national leadership is accountable. Individuals at the national leadership have accountability relationships with individuals of color as well. The chapters have accountability relationships and partnerships with local people, POC-led or BIPOC-led organizations. And then it's important that each of us individually think about who we are accountable to, who's thinking about our work, who's giving us feedback, who's holding us accountable to showing up effectively for racial justice. So I have covered a lot, and I want to open it up to questions for a bit here. And I'm glad to go in any direction, answering questions, clarifying things, and then I'll take a couple of minutes at the end to close up. But I also just want to mention that my book, Uprooting Racism, has lots of resources, questions, exercises, information, historical and current. And my website, paulkivel.com, also has lots of resources. So those are good places to start. I'm going to turn it over to Joan, who is going to moderate the questions. So if you have a question, put it in the chat or raise your hand. I think there is a way to raise your hand. And we'll deal with as many as we can in the remaining time.
Okay. I'm not going, somebody said I should start my video, but I'm not going to do that. We're focusing on Paul and his answers. We do have a series of 3 questions already in the chat from one person. And Paul, if you have a chance to get back to 448 and 449 in the chat, I think it would
Okay.
help if you have a chance to read those, and if other people read them, rather than me reading them out. In this case, whether there are short questions, I think it works well for me to read them. But I don't think it makes sense for me to read these if there are people who do not have access to the chat. I think you will find in Paul's answers essentially what the question was. And so I don't know whether you're ready to start yet, Paul. I'm going to look down towards the end. I don't think there are other questions yet. One person asked about making comments, but unfortunately, not unfortunately exactly, but because we will have time in the future to discuss among ourselves, and that we will welcome that. And here's another question. So if you're ready to work on Eileen's
I can
question,
look through these.
great.
One question is, what does accountability look like between organizations? What agreements, actions, etc.? So the first thing about accountability from your group to another group is to start listening to and showing up at that organization's events and marches, rallies, whatever they're doing, and starting to participate and building up, getting to know what they're about, and making connections with people in that organization, because nobody's going to want to be accountable to you until you demonstrate that you are showing up, that you're actually going to be a partner. And so the first thing is to start showing up. And then you will build relationships. And as you start to show up, you can let that organization know that you're interested in being more reliable and being more to hear more directly what they could use you for in terms of resources, whether it's people showing up or fundraising or other kinds of things like that. And as you do that, you begin to develop a relationship. And at that point, you have people in your group and people in the BIPOC-led organization who are talking to each other. And that's the point at which you begin to talk about formalizing that maybe a little bit more. It's not an agreement, and it's often or at least sometimes compensated, but it's mostly based upon what kinds of resources you can bring to the table and what kind of sustained commitment do you demonstrate in being able to actually support the campaigns that those groups are working on. And so eventually it becomes a partnership, an accountability partnership with a lot of give and take back and forth, but still with your group taking leadership from the campaign, the ongoing political work of that organization. It's not to individuals, it's to organizations at that level. Thank you.
That was great. And I found out just before you started speaking, about answering that question, I found out that the three questions that I mentioned before only came to me, which makes sense, but they are rather long. I'm going to try to summarize.
Okay.
The first one is, basically, the question is, are you aware of ways that people have overcome the hurdle of COVID and interacting, especially among us older women in WILPF, with people in the COVID times while trying to meet new people? So that's, if you want to think about that for a minute, fine. But if you want to say yes or no, you're not aware, that's fine too. And I'm going to look at this next question comment, which is quite long.
Okay. Yes, I think there's still lots of ways to show up. Even though we can't show up in person, communities of color have mutual aid projects. They have campaigns around everything from defunding the police to issues around healthcare and electoral issues. And there's lots of ways to contribute time and energy and money to those campaigns. And so that can look like phone banking. It can look like showing up at city online to city council members or school board, city council meetings or school board meetings. It can look like having a house party and raising money for an organization. There's lots of very concrete and specific ways that we've learned over this last year and a half to keep the momentum going and doing the racial justice work, even though a lot more of it has to be online.
Okay, good points. The second question that Eileen had has to do with your book and updating it and all the things that have been happening and the greater lack of ignoring on the part of white people of problems and so on. So, and she's asking, what would you probably have been thinking about updating your book already. So what kinds of things would you want to share with us that are in the way of updating your book, which the last edition was 2017, in case people don't know? The fourth edition.
Well, I wrote the original version in 1996. This is the fourth edition. So periodically I do update it, but in actuality, mostly what I'm updating is facts and figures and some of the stories and things in it that the core ideas, the core information, the core issues around being white, being privileged, showing up as being allies is really hasn't changed much. So I think that there's always, more up-to-date examples we can give of how racism works. But in fact, we have things the most important thing that has changed is there's a new generation of young BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color leadership, and a clarification at very deep levels of what the issues are. And I would encourage you to look at the Movement for Black Lives platform, which is 4 or 5 years old, but is a tremendous overview and guide to political action for all of us. And then the Breathe Act, which is a follow-up that came out about a year ago, which again has lots of ideas and suggestions for what needs to be done and how to organize around that. So yeah, there's always updating to do, but we don't need to wait around for the next edition to get involved and start, using the tools we have.
Okay, so a couple of questions. One of which is whether you know that we have some Black people in our audience. And I don't want you to just answer that at length or anything. That's a yes or no answer while I'm looking at what the next question is here. We are way past our time, actually, of the time that we have for this program. And I know you want to do a wrap up and so on, but I think you're aware that there are some Black members of WILPF in our audience, but you can say yes or no. If you weren't aware, you could say no.
Yes, I'm aware. And I'm clearly speaking primarily to those of you who are white, but I also speaking to all of you as members of a predominantly white organization with a long history of being a predominantly white organization. So I think both levels are important to think about in terms of both your individual action, but also what's your role in this organization and how is it moving forward and how are you amplifying that work? I want to just thank you all for the work that you're doing. And
Paul, let me just say that there are several people, as you may have seen in the chat, but you've been busy answering the questions, who feel that it would be appropriate for one of the leaders of the Black Liberation Caucus who's in the audience and has asked to speak, not understanding that that's not the format, so that she had her heart set on it. And so I think we could take a minute or two, but I realize that it's not really possible for Teresa, for you to say everything that you would like to say. And we do want to hear, for everybody to know about the session tomorrow, Saturday, where the Black Liberation Caucus will be telling other members of WILPF what is happening and what the plans are and the hopes and so on. And that will be wonderful. And there's a program coming up, and there also, when there may be more, I don't know, be more chance for discussion. I don't know what the Philadelphia folks have planned. If Paul, if you would be—
That's fine. I'm glad to
willing to hold for just a minute.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
On your wrap up.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Teresa, did you want to talk, or is there someone else who was— I believe Teresa wanted to talk and would need to be able to unmute herself. And if someone—
she is unable to.
Thank you. I was able to unmute myself. But Paul, I did send you a direct message, and I just want to thank you for being a reliable ally as you take this journey. And I dropped a couple of names of other reliable allies, and Braden, who I got to know, as well as Sharon Martinez of the Challenging White Supremacy Workshop. And so I gave you my contact information because I want to talk with you more about this journey we've embarked on in the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, US. Thank you, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. And yeah, I'm about to end with a quote from Ann Braden, and Sharon is a good friend of mine. They're both powerful white women standing up for racial justice. Let's see. So I do want to end with this quote. But I just also want to remind you of the questions I opened up with.
Good. Because
I assume that you're committed to racial, gender, and economic justice, that you stand for healing, justice, peace, and freedom. And the question up is really, how are you showing up every day as an ally? How is that being put into practice? And Ann Braden wrote many things that are worthwhile, including a couple of books. But the thing that I want to end by quoting today is, again, directed specifically to those of you who are white. It says, in a sense, the battle is and always has been a battle for the hearts and minds of white people in this country. The fight against racism is not something we're called on to help people of color with. We need to become involved as if our lives depended on it, because in truth, they do. Thank you all very much for having me today, and good luck continuing on with the rest of the conference.
Actually, Paul, I've been slightly off on my clock watching, and someone pointed out that if you have a little bit more you want to say, there's probably time, unless I'm mistaken again.
We have about 2 more minutes for Paul, and then I have a 1-minute message, and then we have a break before the next session, during which we'll have some music.
There's an interesting question here that you might want to answer, which is, what does accountability look like between organizations? What agreements, actions, etc.?
I think I kind of addressed that earlier. So what I would like to say is that there is tremendous amount of material access out there for the voices of people of color. So instead of turning to people of color to ask them to teach us, we need to listen to the music, the poetry, the books, the movies. There is so much rich culture and understanding about how racism works that we can learn from. So I encourage you to really turn your lens and focus on the voices of people of color, especially those who are on the front lines of the struggle. And the other thing is to not to think about doing this alone, because an ally doesn't act by themselves. They act with other people. And one of the ways we've organized SURJ is into chapters, because chapters are a place for folks to find you, to get connected, to get some of the basic information, to be called into the struggle, and then to build into accountable relationships with partner BIPOC organizations. So I don't have anything more to say than that. But please use me as a resource. My website has much material on it, but you can also contact me directly at paul@paulkivel.com. And I look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you. Thanks so much.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, because there's so much more. In addition to all the amazingly good and thorough things that you talked with us about tonight, there is always so much more. So at this point, we're ready for Darian to tell us some things that are happening in WILPF on this subject.
Thank you so much to Paul and to Joan Goddard. I want to encourage people to join us for the Black Liberation Caucus session tomorrow, and also to stay for the session after this one, Changing the Culture of White Supremacy, presented by the Philadelphia branch of WILPF. They'll be talking about the practice that they developed working with Resmaa Menakem's book, My Grandmother's Hands. I wanted to take this opportunity to just invite people, and I will be putting my email in the chat, but to invite people who are interested in our ad hoc national committee that is exploring ways to enhance the variety of WILPF members by helping WILPF members and branches to be more welcoming to different races, classes, cultures, genders, and abilities. Our initial focus for this ad hoc committee is on undoing white supremacy, which is a fundamental problem in the US today, as I believe most of us are aware. If you are interested in this ad hoc committee, which at the moment we're struggling to figure out what to call it, it's the committee formerly known as Localize, because much as Paul has encouraged, this committee is encouraging people to work directly with BIPOC, that is Black, Indigenous, and people of color, led groups in their communities on issues of justice, the issues that the communities themselves are choosing as important for local attention. This kind of direct engagement will give us the experience and opportunity of being white allies, white accomplices, and of course for our WILPF members who are not white, they will have a chance to be allies with their fellow people of color. So at this point, we are going to put up the slide. We're going to very briefly put up the slide for the next program, which will be starting in about 5 minutes. We're also going to be showing a video that relates to the next program. So please, Anne, if you would put up the next slide, and E.T., if you would stop recording.